So, Eric, I think it would be really great. Part of cable is looking at how leaders in industry have gotten to where they are. To start out with, it'd be really great to hear like a little bit about your academic journey and your professional journey that's brought you to being the CEO at Aemetis and gotten you involved in so many other companies in the renewables, oil, gas, and agriculture sectors.
I'll make it kind of short, but I grew up in the Central Valley of California and grew up on a farm with my four brothers. And so we had about 640 acres, roughly a mile squared chunk of land that we ran around with as kids and developed really from raw land back in the 1960s. And when I was a teenager, I inherited with my brothers that mile square chunk of land and started with just basically an alfalfa field. And in an effort to try to create some value, we turned it into an organic alfalfa field. And then we discovered that organic dairies were all very, very small because they had to walk the cows to the field every day. So we developed a mobile milk barn that could milk about 20 cows at a time that we could move around and just use electrical tape to move the cows and put the water and power on the road. And we moved the milk barn every couple of days, and we built the largest raw milk dairy in the United States, and ended up with a 95% market share in raw cheese, raw butter, raw cream, raw chocolate milk, and currently are nationally distributed in the Sprouts grocery store chain with a number of our products. The name of the company is Organic Pastures Dairy Company, and we took a chunk of the land and turned it into almonds, and that became then organic almonds as we sought higher value and more innovative approaches to the almond business. And I think we currently have about 5% of the world organic almond business, and we have a plan to end up with roughly 20% market share worldwide in the organic almond business. So that's my farming career. Is basically just an alfalfa field owner when I was a kid, trying to add incremental value. And if you add in 35 years of work, you're going to end up with something. And that's what we ended up with. Well, by the way, we have probably 110 employees in that business of the dairy and orchard business. And it's still owned by myself and my brothers. And then went to school, graduated first in my undergraduate class, about 800 kids, and did a $20 million leverage buyout when I was a senior. I was 22 years old, and borrowed some money from Wells Fargo and bought a liquid petroleum gas distribution company, and decided using other people's money to do things was going to be a lot quicker way to move along in life. And so I started doing leverage buyouts in Los Angeles. I was a kid with no money. And I cold called a guy who had a leverage buyout firm, and he said, well, sure, come on by and say hello. And so we sat down, met for a couple hours, and he offered me a non-paying position with his firm. His name was John Dean. He was White House counsel to President Nixon during the Watergate years and was a very well-known character at the time, but didn't want to hang around with very many people. And so there were no staff or anything. It was him and me. And about 6 months later, a guy named Barry Goldwater Jr., who was a congressman and famous senator, was his father. He and John had been roommates when they were at boarding school when they're teenagers. And so Barry Goldwater Jr. joined the firm, and it ended up being Eric McAfee, Barry Goldwater Jr., and John Dean. And we did 6 leverage buyouts. And by the time I was 25 years old, I was pretty well connected as an LA leverage buyout guy. They both retired when we sold off the business and built the largest cement company in Southern California. And I started founding companies, and I went on to start a company in the computer business that I started with $100 from each of 3 founders. And we built it up to $50 million of annual revenue and 150 employees in 3 years. I sold out when I was 33 years old, moved to Silicon Valley, ended up founding 7 companies that I took public, and funding 25 companies, primarily with capital from a billionaire that I recruited as a partner of mine. So Billy and I did a 50-50 split on a venture capital fund, and I went out and did all the work, and he put up half the money, and that ended up working well for both of us. And I got interested in energy after the crash of 2000, where we'd been funding the backbone for the internet, and we're looking around for something that had a little more meat to it. And I hypothesized that the internet would change the behavior of the 2.5 billion Asians in China and India, so that they would want to buy things that consumed energy. And that happened to be a good bet. The price of crude oil was about $20 when I started investing in that sector. Ended up building 6 public companies, 2 in biofuels that do about 1.7 billion a year of revenue, and then 4 in oil and gas that I took public, and all on the bet that the internet would change the behavior of Asians by accelerating their appetite for transportation and electronics and all sorts of things that consume energy, as well as plastics, all of which comes from petroleum. And so I found myself now as having completed 10 years as the founder, chairman, and CEO of a public company called Aemetis. I've done that parallel with some of the other things I've been involved with, of course, but have built it into being the largest biofuels plant in California and the largest U.S.-owned biofuels producer anywhere in Asia. We have a 50 million gallon biodiesel plant in India. And I spend some of my time giving speeches at the Advanced Biofuels Leadership Conference, the Abu Dhabi Future Energy Conference, the Edinburgh Startup Conference, and other places. And I hang out with the government of India and the government of the United States. On my board of directors, the former Secretary of Agriculture, Jack Block, who for 6 years served under Ronald Reagan, and Tom Vilsack, and I spent some FaceTime together, and I'm about to spend some time with Secretary Perdue because Aemetis just got approved for a $125 million USDA loan guarantee. We were the only cellulosic ethanol project in the last 6 years to get approved for funding. So we have reasons to have to pay a lot of attention to the political world, especially since agricultural policy and biofuels policy are very closely linked, and it needs to have a lot more input from the agricultural sector and the energy sector in order to have consistent policies that can support growth. So there's your 5-minute intro. Is that what you're looking for?
That's exactly what I'm looking for. And I'm not real familiar with the term leverage buyouts. Could you give me like just a quick explanation on that? Just not real sure.
It's buying a house and taking out a mortgage when you do it. But instead of buying a house, think about buying a business and think about borrowing a whole bunch of money when you do it. There was a guy named Michael Milken wandering around in LA at the time. And so he was using a new tool called high yield bonds to build companies. And so I moved to LA and got involved in that industry of using other people's money, primarily debt, to buy companies and build them up. The leverage part means debt. So you're using debt to build things.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay.
So evidently you found finance to be a useful training ground for starting and operating businesses.
When I was 25 years old and I was coming out of the LBO business, having done 6 leverage buyouts, I met with a guy whose name is on the UCLA School of Business. The John Anderson School of Business was a guy named John Anderson. And John said, Eric, I worked for other people until I was almost 50 years old. And until I learned how to raise money, I didn't have control over my time because all I had to do was show up at work and they would tell me what to do. So at some point in time in your life, you're going to be able to raise money. And when you can raise money, then you control what your life is going to be and what you're going to achieve. Until then, it's controlled by somebody else. And that was the advice I got when I was 25 years old. And so I started doing things where I could say, well, geez, what I really want to do right now is build this product into a real company, and I need to raise money to do it. Let me go raise money. And I raised money from a guy named Oppenheimer for my startup down in Irvine. And a guy named Bill Gates put $85 million into my biodiesel company, and a guy named Richard Branson put $75 million into Aemetis that I'm running right now. And CalPERS put $50 million into it. And if you don't have the tool of being able to convince other people that what you're going to do is going to work, then you're going to have to go work for people that can convince other people that what they're going to do is going to work. So I think the society needs some people that are able to make a convincing presentation about what we need to accomplish. And if you can do it well enough, you're going to be able to aggregate capital and build things.
Super. Well, Leila, if you don't mind, let me kind of set the stage here for Eric and why I thought this would be an important session today. Eric, as you probably know, serves on our cable external advisory board. And during ABLC Next, I had the good fortune of having dinner with Eric. Well, actually, he arrived after dinner, but we sat there and visited till I think it was about 11:30. And he had some really, I thought, powerful ideas about the role our public policy working group could play in advancing the renewable fuel standards policy. And so I thought, well, I don't want to try and represent his perspective. It would be really cool if he would be willing to do that. And so he feels strongly about it, strong enough about it that he's with us today and has indicated an interest in joining us in April as well. And so Eric, if you could, kind of share with our team here sort of your thoughts on what this consortium of universities might be able to do to make a difference in the renewable fuel standard.
Well, good. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you guys. The underpinning of renewable fuel policy at the federal level in the United States is a single piece of legislation signed by President Bush originally in 2005 and then expanded in 2007, called the Energy Independence and Security Act. And it's called the Energy Independence and Security Act because George Bush was president when September 11th happened. And he felt a very significant commitment to trying to reduce American involvement in wars in the Middle East and also reduce the amount of cash flowing out of the United States every day that eventually funds terrorism that comes back and hurts us both militarily as well as territorially. And so the name of this thing, which is the Independence and Security Act, it's not the Energy and Oil Encouragement Act. It's the Independence and Security Act. Is I can tell you lost on most of the people that are enforcing that law, and the number one population that is attempting to try to basically rescind that law or just not enforce it is an industry that in many ways imports oil from the Middle East. And so you can see how you'd see a natural disconnect between their business interests and the interest of the Independence and Energy Security Act signed by Mr. Bush, who was trying not to be reliant upon Middle Eastern oil and therefore Middle Eastern wars. And so the name of that act is commonly, that act generated what's called the Renewable Fuel Standard. It's a system of tracking whether people are blending the required amount of biofuels into their gasoline and diesel and other fuels. It's a very simple system. It's simple to understand. It's simple to calculate. I have read many analyses that have made it a wildly complex calculus, and I can tell you with a high degree of certainty that it is a very simple tracking system. And I think it's important to realize what it is so we can then have a foundation for the further discussion. When you go to the gas pump and you buy 10 gallons of gasoline, you get a little receipt that says you bought 10 gallons of gasoline. And at the end of the year, if you go to the IRS and you want to get a tax deduction for buying 10 gallons of gasoline, you got to show them the receipt. That little receipt under the Renewable Fuel Standard is called a Renewable Identification Number. A Renewable Identification Number is known as a RIN. A RIN is just the receipt saying that you bought the gasoline at the gas station. Now, imagine you wanted to tell the IRS at the end of the year that you want a deduction for the purchase of gasoline, but oh, by the way, you don't want to actually physically purchase it. It's not legal in the tax code, but under the renewable fuel standard, you can actually go to somebody else standing at the gas station and say, you know what, can I buy your receipt off of you? I don't want to actually physically pick up any of this biofuel, but I want to have a little piece of paper to give to the government at the end of the year. Can I buy your renewable identification number? So when you think about it, you would immediately conclude that little piece of paper is worthless to anybody that actually blends the fuel, because you already have the little piece of paper you need to give to the government at the end of the year showing that you blended the adequate amount of biofuel that year. That little RIN is only valuable to somebody who's trying to do what? Trying to avoid complying with federal law that requires mandates. And the entire reason that the law allows that trading to happen so you can buy a piece of paper is to allow some people to just frankly avoid the mandate and not have to blend, even though that's required by federal law. They can go to somebody else and buy the piece of paper. Once you understand how simple that is, then all this complex discussion about, oh, it's unfair and this and that and trading price of RINs all becomes very simple, which is, well, guys, you don't have to buy any of those pieces of paper at all. Just go blend the biofuels in with your fuel and you'll get the little piece of paper for free, because all the producers in the U.S. have to give you that piece of paper when they sell you the biofuel. So just go buy the biofuel and you got the piece of paper. So what are you complaining about? This has been a decade of the oil industry trying to confuse and, quite frankly, mislead people to think about what I just described as being wildly complex, a hugely unfair tax on certain players in the oil industry, and abusive, and a bunch of other things. And the clarity of how simple it is, it's just a receipt that you blended the fuel, and if you don't want to blend it, you can buy it from somebody that did, is lost in the entire discussion. Now, the policy, the renewable fuel standard, is under constant attack. I was in Washington, D.C. just a few weeks ago, garnering support from Senator Grassley of Iowa and others so that they would be able to stand up and say, no, we're not going to change renewable fuel standard despite the misleading statements being made by the oil industry about how this and that, function works differently and all sorts of goofiness. It's, in many cases, it's just actively misleading. What is missing in this discourse is basic information from third-party academics, not the oil industry and not the biofuels industry, but third-party academic type institutions that can actually just describe the working of the renewable fuel standard and provide really simple data that says, well, this is what's really going on here, guys. And by doing 1, 2, 3 studies, however you want to do it, or papers, or just a brochure or a website, whatever. It's just a communication process. You could have a major impact on renewable energy policy in the United States by blowing away a lot of this deliberate confusion and misleading information that's going on in the market, because there's an industry that makes $100 billion a year of positive cash flow called the oil industry that is very, very interested in not losing any additional market share. And as of today in the United States, they've lost 11% of their market share to the ethanol molecule alone. And so further growth in that biofuels business is a big threat to their market share in the U.S. And they are very well funded to provide wildly misleading statements in order to further their business interest. And in so doing, I must say that what ends up is that we end up burning high carbon fuels instead of low carbon fuels, which of course exacerbates climate change. We have higher polluting fuels rather than lower polluting fuels, which increases air pollution, which increases health and environmental damage. We increase the amount of cash that we export out of the country every day. Today, we export about $500 million a day. And by not enforcing biofuels mandates, we actually are increasing the amount of cash we're shipping to the Middle East. One of the misleading things people are told is, oh, the majority of oil production's in the US. Well, that's interesting, but statistically, that means today we import 49% of our crude oil. So does it really matter whether you import 51% or 49? No, not at all. It was declared as a major victory that we're importing less than half of our crude. It's not. Statistically, it's a 1% difference. It's irrelevant. And OPEC supplies approximately 25% of the oil we have. So we are directly funding to OPEC every day $250 million in cash, which directly turns around, funds the people that come back and cause terrorism in the U.S. and directly funds the people we have to go fight in the Middle East. So the purpose of the Independence and Security Act is being confounded by the interests of an oil industry that is deliberately trying to rescind the congressional intent of the policy. And I think coming up with one or two, or however you want to do it, small projects that can help in reinforce the facts of the workings of the renewable fuel standard is an opportunity. It's something which would get you in front of Senator Grassley. This is a very high priority for him. He's from Iowa. He is the senator who's the head of the Judiciary Committee. He's clearly one of the most powerful senators there is, and the message you'd be bringing would be of great interest to him. He, by the way, controls the spigots of a very large amount of grant money, and so you could enhance what you're doing here by taking some of the program funds and putting them back into things that actually create more grant funding. So this is the central policy that underpins the corn industry in the United States and the soybean industry in the United States, which, by the way, corn acres, roughly 90 million acres, is the number one number of acres grown in the entire United States is corn. And soybeans, number two, roughly 70 million acres. So put the two together, you have 160 million acres of land requiring all the farmers and all the tractors and all the trains and railroads and trucks and transportation ships and ports and retail stores. And just think about the value chain of 160 million acres of land being driven by one policy, one federal policy. And here's why it's so important. If you don't take the waste product from the soybean industry, which is the excess soybean oil, if you don't take the waste starch, the donuts in a corn kernel, 72% corn kernel is basically just starch and made in sugar, and turn it into fuel, you will crash the price of corn and the price of soybeans. How do we know that? Before the adoption of the renewable fuel standard, the price of corn was in the $1.50 to $1.90 range, was being sold below its cost of production. And the U.S. taxpayer was funding directly to corn farmers about $5 billion per year to do two terrible things. Number one, produce corn you don't need and subsidize the farmer. That's bad. And number two, to actually pay the farmer to do what's called set aside. Don't grow anything on land you'd otherwise grow corn on, because we not only don't need the corn, we're tired of subsidizing it. We don't even want you to grow anymore. We no longer have a viable subsidy for corn because none of them qualify. The price of corn is now high enough that there literally is $5 billion the U.S. taxpayer does not have to give to corn farmers anymore, because we're now making a valuable byproduct from the animal feed industry. And so if you think about the power of a study or set of studies that communicate directly to Senator Grassley and a couple other leaders, Ernst in Iowa, John Thune out of the Dakotas, he's got Poet, a major ethanol company, is his district. And you just, President Trump, there's a good one. Jared Kushner, Ivanka Trump. These people are, I can tell you right now, actively being marketed to by the oil industry with confusing and misleading messages about what the renewable fuel standard is. And if those interests are successful at weakening or destroying the renewable fuel standard, you will see a crash in the agricultural segment on 160 million acres of land where they can no longer sell their product, and they'll go into bankruptcies in community banks, bankruptcies in car dealers, bankruptcies in tractor dealers, bankruptcies in local school districts, bankruptcies in everything that is being funded by 160 million acres of land. And the clarity of what I just said, which to me is very simple, is in direct opposition to the interest of an industry that's just lost 11% market share to the ethanol business and doesn't want to lose another 5 to 10%, because the ethanol molecule is fantastic. It's 113 octane, which means it's racing fuel. It's the ultra high power stuff you'd put into a racing car to get super production out of it. And it's 34% oxygen, which means it burns extremely cleanly. And when you put it in with petroleum fuel, it's like putting oxygen in a fire. It doesn't put as much smoke. It burns more cleanly. Oxygen causes oxidation, which is cleaner burning. So you put that into your fuel, what's going to happen? It's going to clean up your atmosphere and reduce pollution. So the EPA and the Department of Energy have already adopted 15% ethanol in the U.S. We're at 11% now, as I described. So the oil industry is facing what they consider to be an existential problem, which is if they don't do something about it, this crazy biofuels thing, domestic job-creating investment in the U.S., is going to actually end up being about 22% of the U.S. fuel supply, because that's what federal law says we're supposed to do. And so they're fighting this thing like it was the last stand at the Alamo. And on the other side, you frankly just have a lot of confused academics putting out a bunch of blather around, graphs and charts and everything, and they don't really understand how simple it is. This is just a little ticket you're supposed to ship in, and the only guy that cares about the price of it is a guy that doesn't want to actually comply with the law. So that's, in my view, an opportunity to have a major impact in a very short period of time, doing very little bit of work, but doing it as an independent, academically, federally funded entity, and targeting it to the politicians who need to see the simplicity of the renewable fuel standard RINs being priced only by the people that don't want to comply with the law. If everybody complied, the price of a RIN was in 2012 when everybody had plenty of them, 2 cents. It was a year and a half later when nobody wanted to comply, $1.45 per RIN. These are only traded between the oil companies. Biofuels people get paid no money for it. Consumers paid no money for them either. It's only traded between the oil companies, and when there's plenty of them, they're completely worthless. So if everybody complied with the blending mandate, the RINs would be actually, to tell you the truth, they'd trade for 1 or 2 pennies again.
So Eric, are there some faculty members or academics that you're aware of that you think do a especially good job of articulating this issue that we might be able to reach out to and involve in the process? You can say no.
Yeah, there's a group out of Purdue that does a lot of what they call GREET modeling, GREET. It's a complicated model that's talking about greenhouse gas emissions from different processes and whether this thing called indirect land use. It has nothing at all to do, zero, to do with the price of RINs. But I can tell you it's where academics spend all their time, because it's a really fancy, complicated formula, and you're talking about Brazilian rainforests, and you can get a lot of grant money from environmentalists to go and do a bunch of research. That's really where academia is done, and it hasn't. As a result, academia really hasn't played a meaningful role in the political fight, and it's a fight. There were 64 senators last week that signed an oil industry support letter. There were 38 that signed a biofuels industry support letter 2 weeks before. Trump came down on the side of the biofuels guys. It is a major fight going on, and the academics largely, I think, don't understand the fight, so they don't get in it.
I have a question. I understand the RIN numbers. When I was reading about the RFS, I read that they also are using a D rating system, and to me, I just thought that it was a way to categorize the renewable fuels and chemical products. Is that correct?
Yeah. Is that, who is that speaking? Is that Vivia?
Layla, sorry.
Layla. Okay. Thank you, Layla. You are correct. It is a way to just describe the different fuels. And there's a little complication on it that, again, doesn't have really anything to do with the price of RINs, but it's often used to confuse people about it, where it's like a layer cake. Think of a cake sitting on the table, and you've got 4 or 5 layers of it. Anything that's higher in the layer cake applies to what's below, but something below doesn't apply to what's above. So a D6 RIN is what's at the bottom of the layer cake. And you can't use a D6 RIN to replace a D5 RIN. A D6 happens to be corn ethanol. But a D5 RIN, which let's call it renewable diesel, it's diesel that comes from renewable sources. That can be used to provide your D5 RIN obligation, but also can be supplied for D6 obligation. So if you think about it from a math perspective, you know the D5 RIN is always going to be worth equal to or more than the D6 because it can replace a D6. Mm-hmm. So you just go up the stack, and you just at the top is the cellulosic ethanol molecule. It's the molecule made, same exact molecule as corn ethanol, but it's made from agricultural waste, trees, municipal solid waste. It's made from biomass. It's waste biomass. Think corn stalks, orchard wood that's left over after you chop down trees, nut shells, stuff that's waste. And it has a very low carbon content. And that GREET model calculates, well, if you have a tree you knock down and you burn it, you're going to make a lot of air pollution, a lot of nasty greenhouse gases. So if you took it, and instead of burning it and making that bad environmental outcome, stuck it into a biofuels plant and made ethanol of it, that would be what's called cellulosic ethanol. And the D3 RIN is at the top of the stack. So a D3 RIN can apply to all the other RINs, and therefore it's the most valuable. And so the system for the value, the stack, and all that is interesting to know and very important to know. But from the point of view of the going to the gas station and I'm not buying biodiesel, I'm buying gasoline, it's just a little piece of paper. It's still a RIN. It's still got to be turned at the end of the year. And so it's one of the reasons why people get really confused. They start getting into these things that you're going to get into and you're going to understand, because we'll work together to make sure you understand it. But they don't. I mean, these poor politicians, they start blubbering when they start talking about this kind of stuff. And so largely, it's easy to mislead them. You can tell them all sorts of stuff, and they don't really feel like they're qualified to contradict you.
What exactly are the implications of the RIN trading? Just the way that you were talking about it, that it allows people to just avoid compliance. Why are we allowing the RIN trading then? If it's just allowing people to be complacent and just keep going on and not comply with the RFS standard or the standards set forth.
Ethanol and biodiesel have a long history in the U.S. They were originally formed in the Carter administration, where Jimmy Carter, who's a soybean farmer from Georgia, was trying to get rid of extra wheat and corn in the 70s. And the CEO of Texaco said, well, we have a technology where we can turn it into this biofuel thing, but it costs so much and the price of gasoline is so cheap. If you'll subsidize it, I'll buy this corn ethanol thing and I'll even invest in a corn ethanol plant. And so there was $1 per gallon that was paid not to corn farmers, not to biofuels plants. It was called the blender's tax credit. It was paid directly to the profitability tax obligation, of the oil companies, oil refiners. And it was set up in 1978, I believe, as a way to get a market for this extra crop we couldn't get rid of. And so this is not a policy that was created in the heat of battle or something, and it's all broken and it doesn't work. Hey, we've been doing this since '78. There's been lots and lots of opportunities to do it wrong, fix it. And in 2005, when the first Independence and Security Act was passed, George Bush had the benefit of literally almost 30 years of biofuels blending and policy in the U.S. And so the necessity of needing what I call a shock absorber, but some sort of flexibility in the process. So that if a certain oil refiner, let's say in Delaware, doesn't want to physically invest in biofuels blending in Delaware, that they don't immediately have to go wandering out to Iowa and immediately buy an ethanol plant or immediately set up a rack in San Francisco or whatever, that they basically just buy a piece of paper from somebody who is in Iowa, who is blending fuel there, or is in San Francisco and has built a rack. And it allows the realities of geographic distance and just the delays of the financing world and permitting and all the stuff goes into doing things in the real world. It provides flexibility. And so RFS 1, Renewable Fuel Standard number 1, passed in August of 2005. RFS 2 passed in December of 2007, had this built-in RIN trading mechanism, which, by the way, would have literally meant RINs are worthless because there's no reason to trade them. Everybody's going to buy the fuel. Nobody's going to need to buy any RINs, so RINs are worthless. And in December of 2011, remember Jimmy Carter had given $1 to the oil companies for every gallon? That had gradually decreased down. It was 55 cents a gallon for the year 2011. And if you multiply that times the number of gallons of ethanol purchased, it's about $1.7 billion of taxpayer money. It went directly from the poor widower with 5 children to the oil companies, $1.7 billion in cash in 2011. And the price of ethanol was not $1 above the price of gasoline. It was 50 cents below the price of gasoline. So the oil companies were buying ethanol at a discount of 50 cents and then getting another 55 cents from the poor U.S. taxpayer. Congress said, let's cut this out. This has been going on for way too many years. Price of ethanol statistically is a discount to gasoline. And let's quit this subsidy thing. So they did. They canceled the 55 cents per gallon blender's tax credit in December of 2011. But they left 3.6 billion RINs in the market that had been funded by the taxpayer and ended up in the accounting departments of the oil industry, 3.6 billion of them. And those are known as excess RINs because, quite frankly, those were RINs that were just get out of jail free cards, right? You don't have to buy biofuels for 3.6 billion gallons of ethanol. And so the RIN acts as a mechanism to allow people not to buy a gallon of biofuel. When I say that, I can tell you about 99% of academics would roll their eyes back and say, but what about the supply-demand curve inverse with statistical deviation of 3.6? And I'd say that's irrelevant. It is simply, you're talking about the pricing mechanism, and who cares about the pricing mechanism? It's the fact that if you don't want to avoid buying the fuel, you just buy the biofuel, you don't care about the price of a RIN. The price of a RIN could be $500 a RIN. You don't care. All you got to do is buy $1.40 a gallon of ethanol, sell it for $3 at the pump, make a nice fat profit, and you don't have to pay any money for RINs because you don't need RINs. You get them for free. I give away 60 million RINs a year. If you want one of them, just come by and I'll say a gallon of ethanol and you'll get a free RIN with it. So that simplicity of taking all this pricing out of it, because pricing doesn't matter when you don't have to buy it. You only have to buy it if you don't want to comply with the mandates in the marketplace. The reason why I mentioned the excess RINs is that when you look at RIN pricing, you'll say, well, why were RINs only 2 cents in 2012? Well, that's because there's 3.6 billion of them lying around. And until the mandate had increased to a point in which people were actively saying, I don't want to buy biofuels and I got to buy RINs, the price of RINs were literally 2 cents per RIN for much of 2012. Hello?
Denny, I think your mic is muted.
Yeah. Eric, so we're talking about this thing called a blend wall, and that we're looking at like 10, 11% of the ethanol. Is that real? Is that accurate? Is that where we are in terms of the gasoline, around 10%?
Yeah, the blend wall is a real thing as a political fabrication. It's a real political fabrication. Why? Because the EPA actually spent 6 years million and drove the equivalent of 6 times round trip to the moon to test the best tested fuel in the history of the US government, called ethanol. And they approved 20% ethanol in any vehicle that was 2001 or later, because all vehicles have fuel lines that don't crack as they get old. And just a quick sidestep, one of the misleading things the oil industry loves to do is they say, oh, ethanol is bad for your engine because it messes up your seals and your fuel lines. Well, okay, how does it mess them up? It cleans them out. Ethanol is vodka. You can drink it. If we didn't pour about 1.5% gasoline in it at our plant, you literally would be able to drink 60 million gallons of vodka out of our plant. And nobody worries about vodka being dropped on the carpet. Vodka is rubbing alcohol. It cleans things, right? So what ethanol does is it cleans your engine out. And if you go to the Jiffy Lube and say, hi, I want to do the $99 engine cleaner, you know what they're putting in your car is primarily ethanol. They're putting in ethyl alcohol to clean your car out. So if you have an older fuel line, early to 2001, fuel lines are made out of cheaper rubber and they would crack. And so the gunk from gasoline would plug up the cracks. And when then you come along and you clean those out, they start leaking. So the dangerous aspect of ethanol we should all be afraid of is that you'd have vodka dripping out of your fuel lines because it would clean out your fuel line. And that's the big fear we're supposed to all have about older cars. Functionally speaking, I can tell you right now, if you've got cracked fuel lines, you got bigger problems in your engine than having a fuel cleaner come along and clean it out, and then you got to replace your fuel lines, which cost you like $50. So today the approval by the Department of Energy did the test was 20%. In 2009, the politics couldn't handle going from a 10% blend to a 20% blend, so Congress approved 15%. So today in the United States, it's illegal to run 15% ethanol in any car produced in 2001 or later. And technically, the proof from the Department of Energy is you can go to 20% and it has absolutely no negative impact on your vehicle at all.
So Eric, I understand sort of like the stakeholder, the oil companies and their preferences. Where is the auto industry in all of this discussion?
Auto industry is largely saying, are you going to enforce, Mr. Governor, Mr. Government, the fuel efficiency standards? Are you going to cause us to have more fuel efficient cars? Question mark. Because that's not a certainty, right? And if you left it up to the auto manufacturers, they'd say, guys, I just want to make pickups and SUVs. I don't care about little cars. I don't make any money on little cars. I lose money on little cars. I just want to make pickups. The top selling vehicles in the U.S. are actually pickups, and Ford F-150, number one selling car in the United States. And so, and by the way, wildly profitable. So the auto industry is basically saying, if you're going to mandate more fuel efficiency, then make it a level playing field. Just let me figure out how to do it. I might stick a battery in the thing and do a little hybridization, then put a gasoline engine in as a generator to fuel the battery with electricity. I might do that. I might not. I might just make maybe a little smaller engine and put higher octane in the fuel, because octane is a measure of a very simple thing. When you put fuel under pressure, at some point it pre-ignites. It's called pre-ignition. So when you have a smaller, lighter engine, but you put it under greater pressure so you can get more energy out of your fuel. If your fuel doesn't have very high octane, it will pop, it'll stall and make a sort of a popping sound because it's not exploding at the time that the spark is exploding. You're losing energy. And so when you look at an Indy race car, you probably don't realize there's actually no petroleum at all in the gasoline tank. It runs on 100% alcohol. Because alcohol, ethyl alcohol, is 113 octane. And therefore, you can put it under a tremendous amount of pressure. You have a little itty-bitty engine, like an Indy race car, very light, put a huge amount of pressure on the fuel, get maximum amount of energy out of that fuel, and you actually end up with about 3% more miles per gallon than you would on gasoline. You end up with tremendous emissions profile because you're consuming all the energy and combusting it very efficiently. And of course, you get better miles per gallon because you've got yourself a little itty bitty engine rather than a huge engine. And so the way that Detroit can get better mileage is by having higher octane fuel, smaller, lighter cars, and smaller, lighter engines. But unless they're mandated to have higher mileage and given the flexibility to do that, not forced to have to go, put a bunch of imported lithium from Chile into cars called an electric car and run around doing that because that's just the religion of the moment. If you give them the ability to choose, they would most probably say, let's just put more ethanol in the car and make smaller engines and we'll get you 50 miles per gallon. Don't worry about it. And that's exactly what the fight is in Congress is, are we really going to enforce the fuel efficiency standards? And if you read papers from Ford and GM and meet them at conferences, they all say, we need more octane. If you want more out of us, then you got to give us a fuel we can put under more pressure. Because you can't put more pressure, there's no physical way I can get more energy out of the fuel. I'm going to be still running along at roughly 30 to 35% efficiency because I can't get any more energy out of the fuel because I can't increase the compression.
Eric, this is Zhivia. I worked a little bit in biofuels 6 and 10 years ago. Have not that much in the last few years, but from what I remember, the automotive industry was opposed to the E50, anything above E10, because they were saying it would ruin their cars. So do I remember this incorrectly, or what was behind that?
The oil industry said that a lot. The auto industry said, nah, this is a fuel line issue. We solved that 10 years ago. That was in 2001. We solved all that. That's all yesterday's news. Mm-hmm. I run an 85% ethanol vehicle, and there's 22 million of them wandering around the U.S. They're called flex fuel vehicles, 22 million of them. And all I have, by the way, the only difference on my car than every other car is I have a fuel sensor that costs about an extra $50 that can detect higher oxygen in the fuel. And now why is it necessary? Because ethanol is 34% oxygen and gasoline is very low oxygen. And so the fuel sensor in a regular car is not designed to detect high oxygen. High oxygen, of course, then makes fuel burn cleaner, which means less pollution and all the other benefits. So what we're basically saying as an American society is we haven't yet mandated that every vehicle coming out of Detroit has to detect high oxygen so we can then stuff whatever amount of high oxygen fuel we want to stick in the tank. We haven't made that political decision yet, that there'd be a $50 tax on every vehicle produced in the United States. But that's the only difference between my vehicle and everybody else's. It's not a fuel line cracking issue anymore. You can imagine that issue was solved long time ago. It's all about the oxygen sensor in the vehicle. So and with 22 million cars running around, I'm sure you don't know a whole lot of people have come to you and said, yes, my car was destroyed by vodka that we poured in the tank. That's not a common problem. And if you know the Click and Clack radio show, yes, which was very popular for many years, they are testimonials. They literally do advertisements saying, out of the 200,000 plus cars we fixed in our own shop, we haven't had a single problem with ethanol, but we've had thousands of problems generated by the dirty gunk you get in gasoline. And the idea that you'd even take one or two examples of some ethanol thing and ignore the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of problems you get from dirty fuel, gummed up spark plugs and gummed up fuel lines and gummed up piston heads and cylinders. And I mean, you go on and on. They said somebody's not thinking clearly. If they're criticizing this little molecule, even if they could potentially find it in some weird study, in the real world, you'd say, well, it's so much better than the choice. The choice is this gunky stuff you're running through it already called petroleum. So that when you think about these things in sort of a comparative way, which is, oh, biofuel's so bad because you got to grow corn. Oh, really? Well, bad compared to what? Bad compared to funding terrorism? Oh, no, it's better than that. worse than funding, $200 billion a year of fighting wars in the Middle East? No, it's better than that. So what's it bad compared to? Well, people fail to make comparisons. It's a common statistical error that you fail to compare. So this is where the academics have failed us, completely failed us, in their attempt to create complexity out of simplicity, to create confusion out of clarity. We are desperate for people that just say, well, compared to what? And a RIN doesn't even have to be purchased at all. Why is the guy complaining? Just go buy the biofuel and don't worry about it. We need the third arm of government, which is academics, not judicial, to say, guys, this thing works fine. What's the big deal? Get on with it. Enforce it. Let's focus on what the benefits are and quit messing around with all the excuses these guys are coming up with.
So as far as policy is concerned, this is Julia again. EPA has approved E15, and I don't know what today's EPA is saying. Why don't we see it in the gas stations? Why is it not out there?
It actually is. The E85 is in 4,000 gas stations across the country. E15 is in, I don't know that number, but E15 is being adopted rapidly. The number one reason, and I know this from the business perspective, not because I did some academic study on it, business perspective. The number one reason it's not there is the narco Nebraska lawsuit. What is the narco Nebraska lawsuit? It was a guy who 7 years ago, back in 2009, 2010, wanted to blend 15% into fuel, but was a ConocoPhillips branded station. Mm-hmm. And so he went and he put a pump up and he put in E15 because he's in Nebraska. He had a bunch of corn farmers driving by. The ConocoPhillips organization told him to cease and desist putting E15 in, because they said E10 was their company policy was a maximum that would be allowed in their stations was 10% ethanol. He told them, guys, EPA's approved this. What are you talking about? They said, our policy is 10%. That is our official policy, is that there's a blend wall, and that's all we're going to do. He canceled his franchise agreement, sued them, and now it's known as Narco Gas Stations, not ConocoPhillips. He's an independent gas station owner who sells 85% ethanol and 15% ethanol as pumps. And he's the number one guy to talk to say it's because 97% of the gas stations in the United States, there's over 120,000 of them, are branded gas stations by the oil companies who have stated a strategic policy that they will not support more than a 10% blend, which, by the way, they have to have, because otherwise they have to buy more expensive, nasty things, benzene, toluene. These are known as BTEX additives, so they can get enough octane and oxygenate into your fuel to run. Those additives cost between 20 cents and 50 cents a gallon above gasoline. Ethanol costs the same or less than gasoline. So they have to blend 10% ethanol, otherwise you can't even sell the fuel. Oil refiners in the U.S. back in the 1980s had an average base fuel of 87 octane. That's why when you go to the fuel pump, you always see 87 octane as the cheap stuff. Do you know that today the average oil refinery does not produce 87 octane? It produces 84 octane. You could not legally sell any of the gasoline coming out of oil refineries in the U.S. Why? Because they know they have to blend in the oxygenate, which increases the octane. So they know that they're going to end up at 87 just by blending the minimum amount of ethanol. And they're actually decreasing the amount of oil refining they have, saving the amount of money they could otherwise have had to spend by blending in ethanol. So the 10% ethanol molecule solves their oxygenate problem, and it provides octane so they can then provide fuel to pump. Here's a big anomaly for you, and one of the big reasons the oil industry doesn't like higher ethanol. If you go to the pump and you see E0, E10, and E15, you know what the cheapest fuel should be? The one with the highest ethanol content. You know what the highest octane is going to be? The one with the highest ethanol content. So E15 running at 92 octane should be cheaper than 87. And I can tell you, nobody on this phone call ever goes to the pump and finds that 91 octane is cheaper than 87. It doesn't exist. But if you do the math with ethanol, you actually find that a 95 ethanol or 100 octane ethanol, high blend 30% gives you 100 octane, actually should be cheaper than 87 octane gasoline. That's a structural problem in why the oil industry has basically said it's 10%, and that's just the way it is.
Thank you. Layla, I think you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I had a question and I was on mute. Sorry about that. Why do the different products under the RFS have different greenhouse gas reduction percentages?
The feedstock and the conversion process each have some level of carbon intensity. So I'll give you the most common example, corn kernel. A corn kernel is biomass. It goes through a process of photosynthesis. Where does photosynthesis get its carbon? It's from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So the plant is absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and it's taking H2O. So you get carbon, hydrogen, oxygen atoms together, and you convert them. Add a little solar energy and as the energy source, and you convert it in that little manufacturing plant called the cord plant into the material that the cord plant is made up of. Now, there's some fertilizer required. Well, that's a carbon source as well, but where does fertilizer come from? It comes from natural gas. Where does natural gas come from? It comes from the ground. So anything coming out of the ground that then it ends up being combusted in the engine and goes in the sky is going to actually add carbon to the sky. So when you do the carbon intensity analysis of corn, you're going to look at, okay, where's the carbon coming from? How much comes from atmospheric? How much came from fertilizer? And you're going to do the GREET model to figure out the pathway of all the corn inputs to make the corn. And then you're going to look at the processing plant. Let's say you're in Illinois. There are a few plants in the country that still run on coal-fired electricity. And you're going to say, wow, okay, coal, that comes out of the ground. It's carbon intensive. That means that ethanol that came out of that plant, that process is going to have higher carbon intensity than some guy that's running on solar power or biogas or something else that is low carbon intensity. So each plant in the United States actually has a different carbon intensity based upon the fuel they're producing. And different fuels have different carbon intensity because they have different feedstocks and different processes. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, thank you.
Sure, no problem.
Eric, we need to switch over here a little bit. Well, was someone else wanting to ask a question? Was that you, Rich?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. Eric, thanks very much for this very informative discussion. I seem to recall reading something about Carl Icahn getting involved with RINs through investment in CVR Energy or something. Is that still going on?
It is, and you'll read about Mr. Icahn being under investigation and potentially going to jail because of his attempt to manipulate the renewable fuel standard. He shorted, in other words, he went and bet on the decrease in the price of RINs. He shorted $270 million worth of RINs.
Wow.
He then funded Mr. Trump. Carl Icahn, by the way, is a corporate raider. I've known him since, correction, I don't know him personally. I've known of him since I was a leveraged buyout guy back in the 80s. He does corporate raiding, which means he takes a healthy company and he goes and threatens it with being torn apart into little pieces and then gets paid off by the management teams to prevent him from doing that to them. And so he's worth $20 billion. And he's a mean guy. So he funded Mr. Trump to become president of the United States and got himself into an official advisory capacity, got himself a title, even though he wasn't a salaried guy, and immediately went about the process of calling around government and saying, we got to tear this renewable fuel standard policy completely up and just throw it out. And after Mr. Trump was elected, within a month or two, there was a proposal that we no longer would enforce the renewable fuel standard, and we wouldn't file the reports on time, we wouldn't this, and I mean, he just started screwing around with calling agencies and getting people to do screwy things. Well, at the same time, he was shorting the market. The price of RINs, he was whatever it was, and he was betting it was going to go down. He got $270 million in it, And within a month or two, he had made $50 million in profits on paper by causing the market to crash. As people said, "Oh my gosh, we're not going to need this little piece of paper that I'm getting by buying biofuels or buying the RINs. Nobody's going to need it. The price of this thing is going to go down," and it did go down. And he shorted it, and he made a $50 million profit in a short period of time. So Carl Icahn is the face of the oil industry in this game, and I love it because he is a hated face. Everybody knows the guy's going to get hammered here. It is a wonderful time to jump on the scales on the side of the biofuels business, because on the other side is people lined up with Carl Icahn, and nobody wants to be there. There's a federal investigation that just started in the Southern District of New York, and everybody that has anything to do with RINs is going to get called by that fella to say, "Have you been talking to Carl Icahn, and did you cooperate with him on manipulating the price of RINs and profiting to the tune of $50 million while you were supposedly acting as a government official?" And that the list of violations there is an arm long, and it is a nasty situation. It's wonderful for the biofuels business. It's one of the reasons I'm encouraging you guys to jump on the train that's coming out of the station, because they're stuck in the station. They're just going to get dumped on for a long time about the federal law violations, as Mr. Icahn literally did manipulate the price of RINs by telling Mr. Trump to cancel the policy at the same time as he was shorting. It's almost a definition of how to break federal law.
Thank you. That's a wow. And I think that really helps illustrate to our students really the extent to which people will essentially game the system if they can.
Correct. And there's not a trading system for RINs. If you really wanted to be innovative, if that was one of the goals of this program, you would say, "Guys, why is it we trade RINs in an opaque system where nobody really knows how many RINs are outstanding, and nobody really knows what the trading price was, and nobody really knows who the buyers and sellers are? We don't trade stocks that way." You know, the entire stock market of the United States, the entire debt market of the United States trades in a open platform in which is heavy regulatory structure, so that you don't pay one price and then the broker takes a big fee, and then the buyer pays a different price, and you don't know what the prices are. And what are you talking about? The RINs ought to be like NASDAQ. They ought to quote it on the Chicago Board of Trade is RINs. And when you want to trade a RIN, you go to the Chicago Board of Trade and you put up your RINs, and somebody pays some money for them, and you're good to go. It would create liquidity. It would get rid of this kind of manipulation that old CVR and Mr. Icahn successfully attempted. And, if you want to do some academic work, that would be a fun one. Is, you know what? RINs aren't a mystery at all. They're a worthless piece of paper you get for free when you buy biofuels. They're only worth something if somebody wants to void their obligations as an obligated party. So why don't we require that they have to disclose the amount of their obligations and what they paid for them and how they covered them, so that there's no real game that they can play here. That's just the regular tools of commerce, options and forward tradings and all that kind of stuff you could do, but it's going to be in a disclosed environment. It's not going to be a manipulated environment.
I feel like we need to ask one more question, and it's another one of these things that the oil industry has done to us corn and soybean producers, and it's been picked up by food companies like Nestle. What's your response to food versus fuel?
Response number one is a biology response. As I ask people, guys, there are four things in a corn kernel. There's corn protein, there's corn oil, and there's corn fiber. Those are commonly known as animal feed. And then 72% of a corn kernel is known as starch, which you would usually find in a donut. So you've got the donut, and then you've got three things that are animal feed. Which of those four items can make ethanol? And everybody knows anything would say, well, the stuff that can turn into sugar, because you feed the sugar to yeast. And oh, by the way, you can't turn protein into sugar. You really can't turn the fiber into sugar. You can't turn the oil into sugar. So only the starch, only the donuts, the waste product in a corn kernel becomes ethanol. The animal feed largely goes through an ethanol plant, gets warmed up, gets cooled down, and shipped out and fed to animals. And so when you think about it from the perspective of the ethanol plant, how many dairies and feedlots would they have as customers as an ethanol plant if you charged a premium price for your animal feed compared to corn? And the answer, of course, is zero. You've got to sell your animal feed at a discount, otherwise nobody's going to buy from you. So what does the biofuels business do? It subsidizes animal feed by selling the waste starch into the energy business. That's what's happening, is that cars are subsidizing animal feed. Now, there's one little exception to that, and that is that some of the corn oil goes into biodiesel and helps to subsidize the rest of the animal feed, makes that protein and that fiber that much cheaper, because the distiller's corn oil can't be eaten by humans, but we happen to sell it to the Foster Farms Chicken Company. And they buy it from us because it's more expensive than what they could buy otherwise? No, they buy it from us because we subsidize it. It's cheaper to buy corn oil from us as a biofuels plant than to buy it from any other source of corn oil alternatives they would have. So we are subsidizing the animal feed business, whether we sell it as corn oil or protein or fiber, doesn't matter. It's a subsidized thing. It's got to be cheaper in order to produce ethanol. And so my response is, guys, I know there's profound ignorance around the fact that there's 4 things in a corn kernel, but I didn't know it could last so many years, because it doesn't take much of an academic to figure out that you can't take protein and turn it into sugar. So if you can't turn it into sugar, you can't feed it to a yeast. Yeast is what's converting this stuff into ethanol. If you can't be fed to yeast, then it's going to come out and be fed to an animal. So no duh. All right, guys, we're just subsidizing animal feed here. That's what we're doing.
Well, pigs and chickens also eat donuts, so they eat starch.
Not so many. Not at any level that matters. Let's put it that way. The alternatives are there's huge numbers of alternatives for the carbohydrates, and so the corn starch really literally is a waste product that we extract out of the process.
Yeah, but I was really surprised though when I met with folks at Nestle, and they told me that that they have a corporate policy of food versus fuel and will not use food ingredients, or will not support food ingredients being used as a transportation fuel. That one was surprised, because I would have thought that they were more knowledgeable.
Well, they're very knowledgeable, and I would agree with that policy if I had absolutely no interest in U.S. energy independence. And military budgets and tax rates, I would say the same thing. Why? Because all they care about is, am I buying corn cheap or not? Oh, by the way, they remember the good old days. What were the good old days? When the U.S. taxpayer was paying. Yeah, but that's because the U.S. taxpayer was paying $5 billion of cash. Now that's the soccer mom, that's the hardworking young college kid working at a restaurant, subsidizing who? Subsidizing oil companies and subsidizing corn farmers, so that Nestle can make more money. That was a structure we had in the American taxation policy prior to the ethanol molecule. And I was advisor to President Bush. I was on his technology advisory board for 8 years. And I said, that is the dumbest ass policy I have ever heard. You're telling me that people that eat food are paying higher taxes, going through an extremely wasteful process of 2 layers of government bureaucracy to get it over into the pockets of some big major corporations, because you're worried about a higher price of corn? That's dumb. Get rid of the subsidy, get the market to pay for the molecule being worth more, because it's going into the energy bucket. And I think you know this. This is so old that everybody knows this. You know the amount of corn in a box, a $3 box of cereal is 5 cents. There's 5 cents of corn in a $3 box of cereal. 5 cents. So, oh my gosh, price of corn's up. Well, what it used to be? It used to be 3 cents. Yeah, it's irrelevant. The price of distribution, the price of crude oil, and there's a series of studies that prove this. The price of crude oil is much more correlated with the price of food. Why? For simple reasons. Retail grocery stores require tremendous amount of electricity. That's natural gas that's being burned, which is a petroleum oil, and transportation, trucks. So when the price of gasoline and diesel and natural gas go up, that's what actually causes food prices to go up. And so, and the Department of Energy and the USDA did a whole bunch of studies, the 2009 to 2012 timeframe specifically, actually, and came out and said, guys, sorry, but you're wrong. There's virtually no food cost at all in a box of cereal. It's fuel you're paying for.
Layla, other members of the table, student delegates, any other questions out there? If we probably I'll let Eric move on, and we need to have a little bit of our own discussion around this topic. But before we do so, any last questions?
I had a question about the recent purchase that you made for the LanzaTech license. Was it, well, first of all, when was the Keys plant constructed? That is where they're implementing the LanzaTech process, correct?
Yeah, technically it's about 10 miles away, but you're right. It's an expansion of the corn ethanol plant that was built in 2008.
Okay, all right. Was it difficult for the Aemetis plant to integrate the LanzaTech process into the existing plant, or did they construct a new plant separately?
We constructed a new pre-treatment processing facility. So a corn ethanol plant grinds corn and then puts it in big tanks, and yeast extracts the sugar value and turns it into ethanol. We made a parallel process of that. And then we integrate it when you get to distillation. Distillation is basically separating out the solids and the water and the ethanol. And so once we had solids and water and ethanol from orchards as what's sitting in this expansion unit, then you can integrate the back end and save $30 million of CapEx and a couple of years of permitting and everything else. And that's where the integration with the corn ethanol plant makes some sense.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting.
The study, the marketing concept, the white paper, I really don't care what the format is, but the message in general would fall in a couple categories. Number one, the renewable fuel standard works. It's worked for the last 12 years. It's just pissing off people that don't want to comply. Number two, RINs are really simple. They're just a piece of paper. They're a receipt that says, if you buy the fuel, you got the piece of paper. If you don't buy the fuel, you're lucky. You can buy the piece of paper from somebody else. So you don't really have to ever blend any fuel if you don't want to. Don't worry about it. But don't complain about it. So RINs are very simple. They're just a receipt you turn it in at the end of the year. It's not any more complex than that. They don't cost any money for the producer. I give them away for free. They don't cost anything for the consumer. Why? Because the profits made by one obligated party are offset by the cost of the other obligated party. There's no worries about the price of fuel going. A RIN could literally be $500 per RIN. I don't make a penny as a biofuels producer. They are not paying me any money. They're trading between the oil companies. The consumer would not pay a penny because a $500 cost for one oil company is a $500 profit for the other. So as an industry, the net cost to consumers is zero. The clarity of what I just said, I can guarantee you, is not understood by the politicians that are running this country. And so renewable fuel standard and how the pricing of RINs is basically just only relevant to people that don't want to comply with the law. And it's a lucky deal that they get to go out and buy a piece of paper from somebody that has complied with the law. That's it. To me, that's where all the battles are fought, are on those two issues.
Okay, well, Eric, boy, thank you so much for your time and for your passion on this subject and willingness to share it with some thoughts with us. And if you don't mind, we'll ask you to go ahead and go off of the call so that our team can process a little bit more what you offered in terms of suggestions.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I'll look forward to hearing back from you and hopefully seeing everybody in April.
Sounds great.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Sure. Thank you.
Eric.
Bye.